G'day YouTube, warbles on a lot here. It occurs to me, sad to say it, humanity seems to be playing to lose. Appears to be playing to lose in the matter of biodiversity. Appears to be playing to lose in the matter of biomass. Certainly appears to be playing to lose in the matter of the bat eater's lament virus. We seem to be playing to lose in the matter of anthropogenic global warming. Here at the moment, the New South Wales Rural Fire Service is playing to lose in the matter of reducing bushfire fuel hazard right now in the particular little narrow window of opportunity between the soil being so wet that you can't drive in the same place twice or you get bogged to the floor pan like my son did 2.5 weeks ago here. And when the rain stops and the hot wind arrives and it's about to become too hot and too dry to be safe to light the first burn of the season, the burn where you create a blacked out area on which to anchor subsequent burns. Once it's too hot and too dry and too windy to be able to do that, you're kind of stuffed. You then have to put up with living in the middle of a bushfire fuel bomb that hasn't been ameliorated. Now, I know I've been talking about getting a fire permit probably for 2 weeks, and I've been meaning to get a fire permit for at least that long, because if you light a fire and you haven't got a fire permit during permit season, it's a $10,000 fine. So you got to line your paperwork up. Last week, we started the week with Armidale and Newcastle and Sydney in lockdown, and we finished the week with the whole bloody state in lockdown. I think that was Thursday. I was shopping in town on Friday and I spotted somebody from the New South Wales Rural Fire Service at the auto bank. He was masked, I was masked, we were both outside. So I went over and pestered him outside of his working hours. I said, "Oh, listen, just wanted to know, can I still get a fire permit?" "No," he says. "What? Why not?" "Because a couple of days ago, when the statewide lockdown started, we suspended the writing of fire permits." And I said, but at the start of the week, my place was still too wet to burn. The permits only last for 21 days. I didn't want to get a permit while it was too wet to burn. I figured I'd wait until it's actually the right time, because you got to burn within the window. So I need to burn my place right now, this weekend, this afternoon. I should be burning. He's, "Oh no, it doesn't matter, can't do it. Don't talk to me about reality or the needs of the landscape and the environment to be cared for by the people who lived on it and who live on it now. This is a matter of bureaucratic imperative. The state's in lockdown, therefore the permit officer can't legally go to your place and inspect where you want to burn." I said, "What makes you think the permit officer was ever going to come to my place to inspect what I'm going to burn? I mean, you know, fair sucker the Savaloy, mate." far as I know, I might be the fool on the hill. I might be a mad scientist. I might be a loudmouth tree-hugging greenie. But I am the only person in all of the Northern Tablelands Rural Fire Service area who knows how to raise a 17-year-old to be elected by the local cow cockies and sheep farmers as the youngest deputy captain in the friggin' state. I've got a $10,000 fire hose collection. Last time I ran a solo hazard reduction burn program, I burnt 8.8 acres, and it took me 3 months and 36 fires to do it on me friggin' own. My permit officer wrote the permits for all of those burns that took place during the permit season, and back then the permit season didn't start till September. You could burn in August without needing a permit. So I kind of got snookered by the change brought on by anthropogenic global warming, such that permit season is longer. Summers are hotter and drier. So anyway, old mate didn't come up here and look at what I was going to burn. I told him about it, and he wrote it down as burning off dry rubbish. So getting a fire permit, as far as I'm concerned, it's a bureaucratic paperwork T to be crossed and an I to be dotted. It's something so that when I light up, they don't have to start up a fire truck because somebody else has seen the smoke. I mean, I'd ring up all my adjoining neighbours and tell them, but you light a fire an hour or so before sundown, smoke goes up, and there's always going to be somebody who thinks that fire must be out of control. Look, it's in the distance, it's big, it's smoky. So they ring up the fire brigade and they report it. So you have to go through the paperwork just to give the bureaucrats peace of mind, to give them something to say to the people who ring up worried, so they can say, oh yes, there is actually 5 people who live in that area who've all got fire permits, so it's probably one of them, don't worry about it. If one of them loses control of what they're doing and rings us up, then yes, then we'll go out and we'll help them. Basically, when you live in country like this, the only time you really expect to see a fire truck is if you have made a mess of doing a hazard reduction burn. Some other time when it's safe. You don't expect a fire truck during a breakout day. During a breakout day, the fire trucks are all going to be somewhere else protecting something else, probably a house or infrastructure which has council approval to be a dwelling. They're not going to protect a lawn locker that grew there like Topsy. Now here's the point. These are the water holes in the wheel tracks where young fella, me lad, who's been captain of the Rediston Brigade since he was 24, and he's now 32. This is how wet the soil is, and this is how dry the vegetation is on top of it. What I should be doing this afternoon is coming up here with a drip torch and a leaf blower with a backpack full of water put on the ground, and I should be dropping little spots of fire and standing there to see how far they're going to spread. And when they reach a green area like that one over there, they'll go out of their own accord. And if they look like they're going to go too far, then I get on the other side of them with a leaf blower and I blow the flame back into the blacked out area. And the idea is to create little mosaic patterns of black spots. The idea being that if it all gets really dry and there's an ember attack and a flame front tries to come through here, instead of having lady grass up your ass, and by that stage it'll all be dry, the idea is to have a black spot there, surrounded by another black spot which was created a week earlier. So you do repeated interlocking cold mosaic burns. At least that's my thought, that's my theory. And that's what all the documentaries, instructions and homilies on how to attempt to start a traditional burn regime if you are a landholder in Australia in the 21st century. The idea is that when it's wet and nothing will burn, you prepare, you get your matches and your drip torch, and then as soon as you can go and set fire to anything, straight away after it rains, that's when you burn off. Because believe you me, if it'll burn when the ground is this wet, then in 2 or 3 weeks' time, you don't bloody want that there on a hot day when the wind comes in from any direction. You know, there's method behind the madness. What I was going to do was bring up a whole lot of dead trees, branches, and build a great big stack and burn off. Same place I burnt a 15-foot high pile of dead wood 2 years ago. But it's been too bloody wet to tow a trailer full of dead wood behind the car, so that hasn't happened. But I have got a fire hose and a water cannon sitting here ready to go. It's not as if I'm not willing to look after my place, but the New South Wales Rural Fire Service is conforming with city-bred, town-educated, bureaucratic microbes who've decided that one size is going to fit all, and we don't care what local knowledge anybody may have, what local experience anybody may have, because it's a lowest common denominator game. The game that they're playing assumes that everybody is equally incompetent and equally stupid and therefore needs equal amounts of supervision. And they don't trust their local permit officers to figure out that if somebody says, my place is still running with water, but it's got 3 foot of dry grass beside the water, I want to start burning now while it's safe. They don't fucking well trust their permit officers or the landholders or the volunteers to make those decisions. So that's part one of playing to lose. What the New South Wales Rural Fire Service is doing at the moment is stacking the kindling ready for the next mega firestorm season. As for the COVID, I think today's total in New South Wales was 880 new cases from 200,000 tests. As usual, somewhere around a third of the new cases were people who didn't know that they had COVID, so they have been circulating freely within the community during the infective period. The infective period with Delta variant, by the way, peaks at 36 hours after you first get caught by the virus. You don't catch the virus catches you. So 36 hours after you get caught by the virus, you reach peak shedding of replicated virus. At around about the 3 to 5 day mark, that's when you get your first tickle in the throat. So the virus has got a reproduction number of something like 5 a day. And during that 3 to 5 days, each person who's circulating freely in the community is actually infecting something like 18 others in a worst case scenario. Whoa, this water's really fucking slippery to walk in. I think I might point the camera down and look at my feet so that I don't go arse over tea kettle. Yeah, I need a fire permit to burn my montane swamp. Anyway, whoa, back to the virus. Been gathering a bit of information. And look, see that comes down here and it just stops and becomes a soggy patch. And all that water flows underground over to the frog pond. It seems that the vaccines are not as good as it was first thought that they was going to be. All of the politicians and all of the busyness men and all of the Chamber of Commerce lobbyists, they've all been obsessively pushing the mantra that what we have to do is get close to 100% vaccination, and then we will return to normal. We will open up the doors of all of the businesses. We will start travelling again. We will start gathering again. We will start concerting and sports grand finalising and race meetings and all that sort of stuff. We'll have international airline tourists running around the bloody world to try and impress the hall porter in a motel on the other side of the planet for 10 days before going home to get back to being a telephone sanitizer or a hairdresser's assistant or whatever it is that they do for a living. Well, I'm hoping that all that scummy looking stuff is frog's eggs. It turns out that Shovel Rick, one of my subscribers, took the proof of frog video that I posted last week and he put it on some kind of frog identification app, and they say that there are 21 potential species of frogs living around this little waterhole. So in terms of frog biodiversity, my place is not yet totally hopeless. So we was talking about the COVID and the vaccines, and it seems that in Israel 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine is only providing 39% protection against becoming infected. 39% is not a lot. It's not the worst in the pack though. Apparently in most of Southeast Asia, the Sinopharm and the Sinovac vaccines, they are both only providing something in the order of 30% protection against infection. And a whole bunch of double vaccinated healthcare workers have been dying from the Sinopharm and the Sinovac, which don't actually provide that much protection. So I think Vietnam and Malaya, they're all starting to issue Moderna vaccinations to people who've already had 2 Sinopharms or 2 Sinovacs. So there is that. Also, after I'd had my AstraZeneca, which would be a month ago, so I'm 2 months away from my second AstraZeneca vax. After I'd had the vaccine and I was being held in the doctor's waiting room for 15 minutes to see if I was going to freak out or throw a fit or become unconscious or do anything else, the doctor's missus, who back in the days when I had a job, she was the matron's wife, because the bloke who is my doctor, he was the director of nursing at Vegetable Creek Hospital when I got my first job postgraduate from Concord Repat. Anyway, the doctor's wife, she's a triple certificate RN, RGN as well. She mentioned to me that AstraZeneca gives better protection against catching the virus than Pfizer does, and AstraZeneca, yes, about 1 in 200,000 people with AstraZeneca, they may develop a blood clot, but the blood clots that you get with AstraZeneca, they are a side effect of getting the virus and becoming ill with the virus. And you've got about, I think it's 20 times the likelihood of getting a blood clot if you get the virus compared to getting a secondary side effect blood clot from the AstraZeneca. So it's not as if it's likely to jump out and sandbag everybody who gets the vaccination. You know, why would you be that worried about it? And I said, yeah, well, I came to that conclusion myself, Carmel. And then she said, and the thing is, when you get the Pfizer vaccine, you've got a 1 in 200,000 chance of developing Bell's palsy, which I think 7th cranial nerve paralysis. and it results in having your eye and one side of your face droop, the corner of your mouth. Most of the public was completely unaware of this. It took me by surprise. However, last week, one of glad-ass Berejiklian's ministers was with her at a press conference talking about how, you know, it's all the fault of the population because they're not locking down as hard as we would like them to lock down, and they persist in going and talking to one another. And a bunch of people noticed that one of her ministers had a droopy eye, and they all got on the social media and asked him what was the problem with his eye, and he said he didn't know, and he went off to see his doctor, and bingo, he had the Pfizer vaccination and he's got Bell's palsy. Congratulations. I'm actually very glad that I've got the AstraZeneca vaccination because it appears to be the most efficacious. And if I get a blood clot, I get a blood clot. You know, I don't think I'm going to because it was a month ago. And I'd rather risk a perhaps chance of a blood clot, which I can probably recover from with a bit of warfarin, as long as it's, you know, not smack in the middle of my head or anywhere particularly vital. I don't think I'd like to have one eye and one side of my mouth paralysed. That's not endearing to me at all. So in the excited status of Norte Americano, they've decided they might have to do a third vaccination, a booster shot, because they're discovering, as did Israel, that 8 months down the track after you've had 2 vaccinations, the daily case rate is not much different from the people who've had no vaccinations. However, if you've had 3 vaccinations, your daily case rate is 25% of the unvaccinated. So yes, it's worthwhile having a third vaccination, a booster shot. The thing is, this coronavirus has no reason to mutate into a less contagious or less morbid, less illness-causing variety. What it has a vested interest in doing, an evolutionary pressure towards doing, is to become ever more contagious, to shorten the period between the time that the virus catches you and the time when you become infectious. And if it can simultaneously delay the interval between you becoming contagious and you developing any signs or any symptoms of having the virus, that's how it gets maximum transmission. My gut feeling, off the wall type worry, is that the next mutation, variant, variety of the COVID virus, in order to become more transmissible, a random mutation which is currently brewing in some of the people who are asymptomatic carriers, either because they were asymptomatic carriers anyway, or because they've been double vaccinated and they don't know that they've got the bloody virus. You know, we're talking 40% of people who are double vaccinated are not going to know anything about it. Well, they're able to catch it. Out of those who catch it, 40% won't know anything about it. Out of those who do know about it, they are likely to have a really mild case of the illness. They almost certainly will not need to go to hospital. If they do go to hospital, they will almost certainly not need to go to intensive care. And if they go to intensive care, well, we had a 15-year-old who already had meningitis. He got COVID and went to hospital and he died, and he was, you know, bingo, he's gone. I think there's been one 80-year-old who was double vaccinated who's died in Australia, a couple who were single vaccinated in their 70s. But basically the good side of the vaccine is that it prevents me or you on an individual personal level from having to be afraid of dying. That is an absolute curate's egg of a mixed blessing, in my view. Because people who are no longer personally afraid of catching the virus because they don't want to die, they are much, much, much less likely to wear a mask out of fear of getting the virus. And they probably know that even if you've got the very best mask that you can buy, you know, used to be $5 each at the Good Price Pharmacy in Armidale, but last time I was in Armidale, which is last week, I bought $50 worth and I got 11 for $50 worth because they're $4.49 each. The best K95 P2 or P2.5 mask, it's really only more or less guaranteed to stop 75–80% of the virus that's in the outside air which you would otherwise breathe in from making it through the mask. However, if you've got the virus, if you're one of these asymptomatic shedders, either a natural or somebody who's been vaccinated, if you're an asymptomatic shedder and you're wearing a K95, N95, P2 mask, it keeps 95% of all the viruses that you exhale inside the mask. That's where it's kind of vital for the people who are vaccinated to continue to get the best mask they can. And I strongly recommend getting a barrier nursing infection control style of a mask, a fitted mask, something that's actually going to bloody work. And then school yourself to exhibit exemplary mask discipline, scrupulous mask discipline. As of Thursday in New South Wales, unless you are in your own house, or in my case, I'm 300 yards from somebody cutting firewood on my neighbour's place. If you're outside your house in a municipality, you have to be masked, because there are too many cases of people walking on the footpath outside, crossing each other, and transmission occurring. So that's good. The trouble is, we're bloody near 2 months into New South Wales having an outbreak before glad-ass Berejiklian has come to the conclusion and saying, oh, well, we better do that. Up until now, oh, no, she's not going to tighten down any harder, and she's not going to... We've got curfews too. From 9 o'clock in the morning to at night till 5 o'clock in the morning, you're not allowed out if you're in one of the 12 local government areas of concern in Sydney. It is now illegal on pain of a $5,400 fine for anybody who doesn't have a really good reason and paperwork backing it up, pre-existing paperwork. You can't go and get caught and then make the application, for them to leave one of the 12 areas of concern or to enter one of the 12 areas of concern. The whole of New South Wales is in a state of lockdown, and perhaps that will end at the end of next week. Perhaps. In the meantime, yesterday in Sydney and Melbourne, and again today in Sydney, hundreds in one place, thousands in another place, of childish, immature, immoral, self-centered, counterfactual science denialists have been out having an anti-mask, anti-lockdown temper tantrum and fighting with the police in public places with the protesters not wearing masks. So, yep, they're really shitting themselves in Melbourne, thinking that yesterday's fracas is going to prove to be a super spreading event, because there's a whole bunch of fucking wankers, copulating masturbationists who just can't get their head around the fact that the environment has changed. It doesn't matter what your busyness plan was. Since COVID-19 appeared within the human herd, the environment has changed, and you have not lost any money. You might be in debt. You might have expected certain earnings. You might have expected certain profits. And that has failed to come to pass. You have not conducted the trading that you expected to be able to conduct. You have not sold anything that you expected to sell. You haven't had the turnover, but you haven't lost anything because you didn't fucking have it. You didn't have $500,000 and go to the pictures and come home and find that you'd left it under the seat in the theatre. No, you didn't lose $500,000. You failed to earn however much money you're thinking about having lost. It's all that happened. Your business plan failed. It was defeated by a change in the environmental conditions. Just like the bloke who had a chainsaw factory and cut down all the trees in the forest suddenly found his business plan was up to shit because nobody wanted to buy any more chainsaws because there was no trees to cut down. The business plan failed. What happened to Britain and Europe's cod fishing fleet in the 1970s and 80s? They all went broke because they fished the last fucking cod from the ocean. Their business plan failed. They didn't lose money. They fucking went broke because they took on a whole lot of debt they couldn't afford. Why am I still here? I didn't buy any more land than you could afford to pay the rates on if you were unemployed. So no matter how little income I could possibly have as an Australian citizen, I could still afford to pay the rates, so I wasn't going to get kicked off. So I'm still here. COVID hasn't caused me to lose any money. They pensioned me off 20 bloody years ago. And as part of the COVID economic stimulus package, people who are on the pension in Australia, you know, there was Job Seeker and there was Job Keeper and there was all these things. They doubled some payments. I think the dole was doubled. You know, like it went bonk from $450 per fortnight to $950 per fortnight. And at the time, the old age pension and the disability pension was only $900 a fortnight. So for the first 6 months of the JobKeeper program, being unemployed was actually paying better than being on the pension. Did I complain? Fuck no. Why would I complain? However much money they give to you as a pensioner, you just say thank you. It's okay. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to argue. And then they had this stimulus thingy and they gave us $750. Bonk, it just landed in the bank account. Wow, that's interesting. I wonder what I'm going to do with that. And then 3 months later, plonk, another $750 hit. And then before Christmas, bang, have another 250. And then another 250. So I'm pretty sure Scott Morrison gave every pensioner in Australia $2,000 to go and spend in the economy and make the wheels of commerce continue to turn over. That push bike I bought last week in Armidale, the list price on the push bike was $2,199. So that's what I did with my COVID stimulus package. I bought the push bike, the extra solar panel, the batteries, the spare battery for the bike, the hat, all of that, the spare charger. Yeah, I had to save up for all that. But the actual push bike, that's pretty much the Liberal National Party's gift to Warbles on a lot. Thanks, fellas. I am, in fact, duly grateful. I don't know whether I could have done it without you. Suppose I just would have had to pull my belt in and live like I was on the dole, as I was for a long time. And it's not bloody easy raising kids on the dole and paying rates, but can be done. It could be done when I was doing it. I don't know whether it can be done anymore. And even then, you had to have supportive parents. But I digress. I were talking about COVID and playing to lose. And as far as I can see, the way for humanity to have played to win with COVID, what we should have done, as a lot of people were advising at the time and as did not occur, what we should have done was have a strictly enforced quarantine, social isolation, lockdown globally. You know, the head of the United Nations, World Health Organization, should have put out a red flag banner warning to all governments, don't fucking argue with this. Every citizen stays at home starting maybe 24 hours notice. But the problem is with giving notice that you're going to pull such a quarantine-based crackdown is there's a whole bunch of assholes who decide, oh, there's going to be a lockdown because there's a disease here. Fuck, I better run away. So they run away and they carry the friggin' disease. When Armidale went into lockdown 2 weeks ago, it was announced on a Saturday afternoon. And according to Facebook accounts that I've been told by my mother and my son, therefore I kind of believe it, the car park of the Glen Innes Woolworths was absolutely jam-packed on the Sunday morning. And the curious looked at one another and said, what's going on there? And a few of them made an occasional inquiry of the people who were running frantically around, filling shopping trolleys with everything. They were all from Armidale, which had been put into lockdown the day before. So they weren't supposed to fucking be in Glen Innes. But what they'd decided was that if Armidale's in lockdown because there's been COVID in the shitworks at Armidale for about 2 weeks, maybe 10 days, and now they've found a couple of cases, then COVID's in Armidale, and they didn't want to do their shopping in Armidale because they might encounter someone with COVID. They live in Armidale, they've been walking around with whoever's in Armidale who's got it, but they decided to just gratuitously drive 60 miles up the road and do their shopping in Glen Innes. And if they brought their COVID to Glen Innes, well, you know, suck dicks, you live in Glen Innes, and we're the fucking intellectual elite of the Tablelands. We live in Armidale, you know, Barnaby Joyce territory, Adam Marshall territory. Yeah, why would they fucking obey quarantine principles? Hey, they want to run away. They want to get away with it. Everybody wants to do what they want to do. Being in quarantine doesn't mean you can't do what has to be done, but you've got to have a really bloody good reason for it, and you need to clear it with the authorities before you do it. When I heard on the Monday that my mother was going to be discharged from Armidale on the Wednesday, while I was in town, I went to the cop shop. I found a police officer, not at the cop shop, because they've got a sign in there that says, if you're here wanting to talk to a police officer, go away and call the phone number. So I wrote down the phone number and I went away, and in the main street I encountered a police officer by random, spontaneously, you know. No point having a God theory unless it works every day and in real time. You want a police officer, one will appear. And I outlined the situation and I got the official advice, or, you know, footpath consultation advice, that, yeah, okay, caring for aged relatives is a perfectly legitimate reason to come outside of your house and do what you got to do. So, yeah, you can go and collect your little old mother and you can bring her back home to her place. And not only can you continue your 3 days a week chopping of the firewood and moving of the garbage tins and doing of the shopping and, you know, propping her up and keeping her out of the nursing home, because that's really expensive for society to have somebody in a nursing home. And it's kind of not much fun for the inmates either. But anyway, yeah, if she's fresh out of hospital and you need to go over there and check on her every day, you can do that. Just don't bloody stop in town and do other things. Don't go and visit people for the fun of it. Only do the shopping. Only go to places where you actually kind of got to go. Well, if you're actually genuinely trying to stop a virus, maybe that's not quite strict enough, even with the curfew and the masks and all the rest of it. I think if I was barrier nursing dictator of the world, I might say that the police should be wearing full PPE, protective personal equipment, with respirators and face shields, and they should be walking the streets with fucking guns drawn, ready to shoot anybody who hasn't got a really, really, really good reason for being there and really, really, really good PPE. Because the way for the virus to be stopped in its tracks is if the virus dies in whichever human the virus is in at the time. So yeah, I'm a mask Nazi, I'm a quarantine Nazi, I'm a vaccine Nazi. I think everybody should be having the vaccine just to reduce the load on the hospital system. I think the vaccines, they should have been manufactured en masse. They should have been stockpiled and distributed en masse. The stockpiles should have been distributed all around the bloody world so that anybody, anywhere in the world, could, if necessary, walk to a vaccination centre within 1 week. It'll take time to set that up. So during that time is when you have your lockdown. The lockdown is one attempt to kill the virus, but you accept the fact that you're not going to do it. You will reduce the virus's numbers greatly, but some of it will still be out there circulating because viruses are really bloody hard to get on top of. But once you've got your disseminated vaccine stockpiles, once everybody's been educated up to the fact, then ring the starters bell and vaccinate all 8 billion of us within a week of each other. And then you wouldn't have this fucking disastrous potpourri of people half vaccinated, fully vaccinated, unvaccinated, all running around with the government telling us, oh, when we get to vaccination of 70% of the eligible citizenry, we'll be able to relax the lockdowns. When they say 70% of the eligible people, they don't mean, they mean people over 16, right? Or maybe it's people over 18. 20% of the population is under fucking 18. If you're only going to vaccinate 70% of 80%, you're still going to have 30% of the actual people who are walking around, plus the children under 18, unvaccinated. But it sounds better if you say, oh, we're going to reach 80% of the eligible population having had their vaccine. Marketing jism doesn't work against viruses. What works is quarantine, strict and enforced and total. That's what works. And quarantine with exemptions. Oh, we'll let the diplomats be exempt from quarantine because they have a diplomatic passport. Bullshit. Oh, we'll let the airline crews be exempt because, you know, they're only going to be here for 2 days. Bullshit. Oh, we'll let the contractor who drives the vehicle for the airline crews to the quarantine hotel, we'll let him get away with not having a mask because when he was employed, there was nothing in his contract that said he had to wear a mask. And his employer, who's a secret anti-vaxxer or COVID denialist or whatever it is, they cling to the idea that if we force our drivers to wear a mask while they're in the car with overseas airline crew, we wouldn't have any drivers. They'd all jack up and fucking refuse. Great. Sack the fucking lot of them and get somebody who's got a brain in their head. This is an evolutionary moment for humanity. And it appears to me that anywhere from 30 to 80% of humanity doesn't fucking get it. They think it's going to be over really quickly and easily. They think COVID is going to die out and become the flu. It's not. In the same way that every year when you get a cold, you get just as bloody sick as you did last year. Every year when you get the flu, if you don't get that year's new flu vaccination, which is a combination of 5 different flu vaccinations all in one jab, when you get the flu, you'll get just as sick. COVID's like that. It's going to continue to mutate, but it's not going to become any less transmissible and it's not going to become any less deadly. And the business as usual lobby from the Chamber of Commerce, they don't want to know that. That's not what they want to hear. They want to hear that we can do whatever we fucking want to do because that's what we've always done. They want to hear that you can just ignore all of the science because there's this economic imperative. What they want to do is please the people who live in the suburbs. Please the people who didn't want to learn about anything but making money and living where there's lots of jobs and where the money's easy to earn. And the funny thing is, the higher the population density, the more people who live in the high population density areas feel miserable, depressed, and lonely because they don't know anyone. Or other people make them anxious because the other people might be bad people. So there's all this technology which could work if it was applied. Vaccines can be good or they can be counterproductive. Vaccines can turn the vaccinated who refuse to wear masks into ambulatory breeder reactors, replicating virus, not knowing it, and blowing the whole new virus, which has already defeated the best that a vaccine-boosted human immune system can come up with, and they're blowing that in the neighbours' faces because the neighbours are vaccine hesitant, or they're refusing to be vaccinated because they think that the vaccine hasn't been tested for long enough. This bloody vaccine for a coronavirus, it's not an actually new vaccine, because they started making vaccines for coronaviruses 10 years ago. The first time we started getting a coronavirus, they called it sudden acute respiratory syndrome. That's when people started making vaccines for a coronavirus. What they've done is they've taken an existing vaccine and they have fine-tuned and tailored it to work on the new virus. A whole bunch of denialists don't want to know about that. So, how long it's going to be before Australia gets a hold of its corona problem, I don't know. Whether it's going to actually matter, I really don't know that either, because I have pretty near full confidence in the vaccine, in the virus's ability to mutate and become more transmissible. And in becoming more transmissible, I think it's probably not going to give a shit what it does to the hyaline membrane on the inside of a person's lungs, as long as the virus can jump out of the person it's replicated in and into some new host animal before the first host animal dies, then the virus will be happy with that. You know, viruses don't go away and retire to the coast. You know, the viruses don't get to go and visit the grandchildren at Christmas time. Viruses get into a host, they get into a host cell, they strip themselves down and they replicate. And when the cell is so full of viruses that the cell dies and bursts, then the virus comes back out and then it tries to get out of that host and into a new one. That's all the virus is trying to do. Replicate and move on. And there's a whole bunch of people who want to pretend that they can wish that shit away. Oh no. We're going to have to be really, really serious about it. And then, on the other hand, we've got biodiversity and global warming. There's a new IPCC report coming out. I'm a week behind in my New Scientist magazines, but what I've read suggests that Earth's atmospheric sensitivity to carbon dioxide concentrations has been underestimated. It was thought that if we could hold carbon dioxide concentrations to a mere 200% of what they were in 1750 before we started industrially burning coal, if we could hold it to 500 parts per million, then the atmosphere of the Earth on average would warm up by 1.5 degrees. That was the minimum, most conservative estimate of how much it would warm. It turns out observational evidence and data from the last 5 years is indicating that the absolute minimum amount of warming that we are going to see if we continue to raise the PCO2 to 500 parts per million, it's going to be 2.3 degrees average. We're also kind of discovering that it's not the average temperature that matters, it's how fucking hot it gets. It's how cold it doesn't get. It's the extremes that drive the catastrophic changes. As an example of that, when I was a kid here, we used to get 6 to 18 inches of snow, you know, what's that, 15 centimetres to 45 centimetres of snow, in maybe 3 to 6 drops of snow every winter. And then once every 10 winters, we would get 3 foot of snow, a metre of snow, and it would lie on the ground and it would stay there and take a week to melt. And the highways would be closed and everybody would just have to have firewood stacked up so you could go for a week at least, because that happened. It's why the first white fellas into the area were firmly convinced that Aborigines didn't ever live here in winter. They must have all gone down the coast. Well, you know, geriatric Aborigines with arthritic hips couldn't walk, so some Aborigines stayed here And some young Aborigines stayed here to hunt and gather for them and carry firewood. But now I'm 60, and last time I saw 3 foot of snow, I was 23. It was 1984, and I couldn't get to work for the best part of a week because there was snow and ice on Rummery's Hill. There was snow and ice on Waterloo Range. There was a 6 foot, 2 metre snowdrift over the New England Highway between Dundee and Deepwater. You could not physically drive from Glen Innes to Emmaville. So my 4 days off turned into 7 days off. 1994, that didn't happen, but 1974, we had 3 feet of snow. And I couldn't get back to boarding school after a 2-day home weekend. The year the OPEC crisis really hit Australia hard, and the boarding school didn't have enough money to pay for the heating oil to keep the school going. So they just sent everybody home for a weekend, and then the snowstorm hit and they left us at home for a week. 1964, I played in the 3 feet of snow. I made snowballs with it, with my sister. 1956, there was 3 foot of snow, and I wasn't even conceived back then. But yeah, that's how much snow there was back in the day. What I can say with absolute certainty is 25 years ago, back to 28 years ago, in May, I used to go to a music festival at the local hippie commune, 50 k's east of here. And at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I would go home. And I had a diesel car and it had a fuel preheater in it. And the temperature at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was starting my diesel, first time it ever actually kicked in and activated, was at the Stockwood Music Festival, because it was minus 15 Celsius at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it was still minus 12 25 years ago. We spool that forward in time 3 years ago, last time I was at Stockwood, it was plus 11 degrees at 3 o'clock in the morning. Second weekend in May. So we've gone from minus 15 to plus 11. 26 degrees difference in the overnight winter minimum temperature. That means that the soil no longer freezes in winter. That means that the vegetation no longer stops growing in winter. That means that unless, like this year when we had a negative Indian Ocean dipole and a La Nina combining to give this part of Australia what once upon a time used to be a normal winter's rain, for the past 20 odd years, we've been as dry as a bloody bone during winter, and we've gone into spring surrounded by fully cured bushfire fuel and ready to get burned. And now, because of COVID, you can't burn off in the window when you need to start burning off, so that you've got a black spot to anchor your subsequent burns on. A couple of weeks ago, one of the channels I'm subscribed to, a fella called Blanco Lirio, who's an airline pilot, lives in Oroville in California. He did a little short video explaining that because of California's environmental laws, it's become unpopular for heavy transport drivers to go there. And now they've got a horrendous wildfire season, and they're using huge quantities of aerial attack equipment. So they've got lots and lots of 4-engine turboprops and 4-engine jets and twin-engine turboprops and single-engine turboprops and single and twin-engine helicopters, and they're all flying around pretending to be rainstorms in the middle of a drought because the landscape is on fire, and they all run on jet fuel. And according to Blanco Lirio, they haven't got enough qualified, licensed fuel truck drivers to deliver the fuel from the refineries and the depots out to the airports where they're just going through it. You know, they have 100,000 gallon or 450,000 American gallons, are tiny little undersized shits of things. 385,000 litre storage on the airbase, and it's all privatised, so it's all been, you know, made as efficiently as possible according to forecasts that were 20 years, or made 20 years ago, and therefore they're all fucking out of date as regards how much fuel you need. I watched all this and I thought back to 2002, after I'd fought my first firestorm, and at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a dust storm hit with, you know, 70 or 80 kilometre an hour winds. You know, we're getting up to 50 miles an hour, and the visibility was down to the point where you could barely see the trees over there. And we went backwards 50 kilometres in a day from Ashford to pretty much the Glen Innes airport. And afterwards I wrote to Philip Coperberg, who was the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Commissioner, and I put the point to him that all of our firefighting equipment runs on diesel and kerosene. And to throw out 10 tonnes of water, you have to burn about 3 tonnes of kerosene, and the kerosene, 3 tonnes of it, that comes out as 8 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So we're literally cutting our fucking noses off to spite our face, because our most effective firefighting techniques and equipment are some of the most polluting techniques and equipment known to man and woman. And I said, what are we going to do here in Australia, where even back then, 19 years ago, I think then we had 3 oil refineries, now we've got 1 perhaps. Back then, as now, we have no government-owned storage facilities for refined transport fuel, because back in the 1970s, the Fraser Liberal government decided that it was far more efficient, accounting-wise, to close down and remove the tanks and fill in the holes where every government-owned fuel storage facility used to be, and simply have the government vehicles turn up to a commercial operator and use a government credit card. And that way, all the cost of maintaining the fuel storage facility, and they're pretty expensive because there's a long list of criterion you have to meet, checklists you have to tick off on, and you've also got to have insurance for it. All those costs could be shunted onto private enterprise, and then the taxpayer wouldn't have to. And is the taxpayer of Australia really in the business of storing fuel, or running a post office, or running a telephone system? Surely not. Surely we can privatise this and give the business to our party fund donors, and once they become commercial monopolies, they can crank the prices up, and they can reduce maintenance staff, and they can stop keeping spare parts, and they can stop doing preventative maintenance, and then they can run the whole system on an emergency repair basis, and all the money they save on not running everything properly, they can give that out to the shareholders, and that'll be the politicians who thought the scheme up. Well, what it means is here in Australia, at any one time, we have 21 to 27 days worth of refined transport fuel here on the continent, ready to go. It all comes in on a boat. The boat comes from the Persian Gulf, it comes from Singapore, or it comes from Venezuela. There are 47 of these boats constantly afloat, chugging across the ocean, bringing the motion lotion to me so I can burn it in my chainsaw, or my whippersnipper, or my leaf blower, or my generator, or my water pump, or my motor car. You know, I'm not saying that I'm not one of the scumbags who's caught in this situation, because I am. I just know about it, and it gives me the shits, so I think about it, and I talk about it, and I organise my thoughts concerning it. So we burn 3 of these boatloads full of refined transport fuel every day under normal circumstances. At the moment, I don't know whether the boats are still coming at that rate, because other countries are having problems with COVID, and they're having lockdowns too, and maybe some of the boats are not arriving. But we don't actually own any of these ocean-going oil tankers in Australia. We rely on oil tankers that belong to other countries entirely. Holland, America, all of them registered in Liberia, so their standards of operation are up to shit. But no, we don't own any oil tankers. We just rely on overseas oil to be refined overseas and brought to us in a ready-to-go state. And we only keep less than a month, 3 weeks, more or less, most of the time, on hand. And we have this great big electric power grid stretching all over the countryside so that Queensland can sell power down through New South Wales to South Australia, across the Bass Strait to Tasmania. Oh, it's lovely. Western Australia's got its own grid, but Northern Territory's got its own grid, but the whole East Coast and the South Coast is all hooked up. And 60% of the grid is either coal-fired or it's gas-fired. And our grid's, it's essentially 50 cycles per second, so it means all your generators have to run at 3,000 revs per minute. And all of your peaks and all of your troughs have to be synchronized. And once you've got a synchronized grid, mechanically synchronized by altering the speed of the generators, by changing the steam pressure in the turbines, which means you have to shovel more or less coal or squirt more or less oil or pump more or less gas into the furnace to keep the steam pressure up to the point where you can run the turbines, to mechanically synchronize the grid. That's when your solar generated power, which comes rooftop to a grid tie inverter, can go into the grid, and you have to synchronize every house's individual inverter with the peaks and the troughs. The wind farms are the same. The windmill makes DC power, pumps high voltage DC power down to a grid tie inverter that turns it into AC and then connects it to the grid. The point is, if you don't have the fossil fuel to run the coal and gas-fired generators, then you can't synchronise the grid, and all the windmills on all the hills and all of the solar panels on all the roofs in all the suburbs, just fucking ornamental. You can't use any of it. The only way that you can use wind and solar, if you don't have a synchronised grid to plug into, is you have to buy the fucking batteries, and you have to have a standalone inverter. Like some certain mad scientist hillbilly I could think of. Even the mad scientist's mother has a standalone inverter and batteries and is not connected to the grid. Yes, it means the cost of setting up your system is higher. And yes, it means that you have to start small and slowly add to it and build up as you realise that having a little tiny weenie system is actually something of a pain in the arse, because you have to keep burning the generator anyway. You might as well have a bit of a shit kicker of a system. You have to get your head around the idea that, yes, it's a good idea to reach absolutely full batteries by about 11 o'clock in the morning on a sunny day. That way, if it's a cloudy day, you'll reach full by about 2:33. And if it's a rainy day, you'll be able to put up with 2 of them before you have to start the generator. I know one bloke who built himself a shit kicker of a system, and he didn't run his generator for 7 years. 7 years. He told me that he reckoned there was less damage done to the environment by using a dishwasher to wash up his cups and saucers and plates on solar power than there was to light the fire and heat the water in a kettle and wash the dishes by hand, because his solar system wasn't putting any smoke in the sky. And the people who say, and I used to be one of them who wondered, how long does your solar system or your windmill run before it saves enough carbon dioxide in prevented fuel emissions to make up for the emissions that were created in the manufacture of the solar panel or the windmill? And the answer is, drum roll, 6 to 18 months. And a 20-year-old solar panel is probably still going to be putting out 60% of its original power on a blue sky sunny day. So you get 20 years before you start thinking about replacing the panel, unless you let it get smacked by a hailstone. Smack it with a hailstone and the bloody thing dies that same day. But, that's a care and maintenance and operational issue, isn't it? If you put your solar panels on a tracking array so you can turn them edge on to the hailstones, it's not quite as catastrophic an event if you get a hailstone mark on the edge of the aluminium frame. because you had the presence of mind to prepare a system that allowed you to respond to the coming of a hailstone. But meanwhile, all our politicians have been captured by the business as usual lobby from the Chamber of Commerce, and what they want to do is end the mask mandates, end the lockdowns, go back to normal busyness conditions so that we can resume fossil burning on an unlimited scale. While the IPCC says we have to, no excuses, no denial, no rationalisation, we have to reduce fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere by 50% by 2030, which is 8.5 years away. And that's going to be the easy part. The difficult part is going to be reducing fossil carbon emissions to the atmosphere to zero by 2050. So you do the difficult bit in the second 20 years, you do the easy bit in the first 8. Now, it didn't have to be like this. People could have listened to the Greenies 40 years ago when Jimmy Carter was putting solar panels on the roof of the White House. You know, the ones that Ronald Reagan zapped, the ones that he pulled down. Speaking of Ronald Reagan, not only was he the fucking idiot who repealed the fairness doctrine, which used to make it against the law to tell lies on the news in America, or lies in newspaper editorials, any news that crossed state borders had to be able to be proved true according to the best science at the time. Rupert Murdoch went to America and he lobbied Ronald Reagan and he said, look, this is how did he put it? It's an unconstitutional constraint against my constitutional freedom of speech. And Ronald Reagan talked to his wife and Nancy talked to her astrologer and the astrologer said, that sounds fair enough. So Ronald Reagan repealed the fairness doctrine and all of a sudden half-wits like Rush Limbaugh and Alex Jones went from being kettled, isolated little lunatics talking on late night radio on a Sunday night in the backwoods. They became national phenomenon. And Murdoch proved to the rest of the world that it's a lot cheaper to run an entertainment channel branded as news and have ignorant, arrogant, ambitious talking heads peddling absolute bullshit and alarming conspiracy theories which cause the population to be absolutely entranced, captivated by the outrage of their own anger at if this is true and if that is true. It's all hypotheticals. None of it's proven. And anytime anything comes up that is proven, they naysay it. So, what else did Ronald Reagan do? Well, he was the president when a bunch of people from the Palestinian Liberation Organization got out there into the Mediterranean and they hijacked a boat. And the boat was called the Achille Lauro, and it was a tourism cruise shippy sort of a thing. And these fellows went through all the passengers with guns drawn and they wanted to look at the passports. And they were hunting Israelis, you know. It was back in the 1980s. The Palestinians had been pissed off with Israel since 1948 when the United Nations suddenly decided that because Hitler had been a really nasty arsehole to all the Jews of Europe, therefore, instead of shipping Europe's Jews to Madagascar or Mauritius like Hitler wanted to, instead of shipping them to the northwest corner of Tasmania like a bunch of Jews in Australia wanted to do, no. The United Nations decided that what they would do was put them all in the League of Nations mandated protectorate of Palestine, which was under British administration. And the Palestinians didn't like that idea. And the Jews pointed at their religious books, and the Palestinians said, well, we don't care about your religious books. We've been living here for at least 1,000 years. And the Jews, oh, boo-hoo, Torah, Torah, Torah. Let me tell you, for the last 20 years, I've been reading in New Scientist successive stories by archaeologists who are digging around all over Israel, and nobody can find any archaeological evidence that the ancestors of the Jews ever bloody lived there. It's all bullshit. It's just a story they fucking told themselves. But anyway, because of that shit fight, the Palestinian Liberation Organisation commandos, and that's what they are. They were commandos, not terrorists. Terrorists. Terrorist is a word that was invented by Joseph Goebbels. He invented it in 1942 when he was talking about the British Royal Air Force aircrew who had just bombed Rostock and Lubeck and firebombed the whole fucking wooden cities. And he described them as terrorfliegeren. And then when partisans started to become a really serious logistical problem for the Germans in Russia and Yugoslavia and Greece and France and Holland and Denmark and Norway and all of the occupied countries, they started calling partisans terrorists. In July 1943, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command sent 667 aeroplanes to a place called Hamburg, and 65 or something of those aeroplanes were Australian, and they had 8 or 9 on each, so Australia did 10% of the hamburger cooking that night. 43,000 hamburgers were killed and grilled in one night. So you can see why the idea of throwing explosives at civilians for a political purpose, that's called terrorism. Who was the first people to be called terrorists at the end of World War II after all of the Nazis had been shut down? The Zionists in Palestine were labelled terrorists by the British-mandated Palestinian Authority. Ariel Sharon and Yitzhak Rabin were both arrested and jailed because they were wearing dresses and wigs and lipstick and makeup while throwing hand grenades in the windows of Palestinian coffee shops and then using British Sten guns that were given to them to fight the fucking Germans with, and they were shooting up the shocked, stunned survivors. 2 of Israel's founding prime ministers went to jail for terrorism in 1946 and 47, which is why the Arab nations surrounding them call Israel a terrorist state. Next, it was the Mau Mau terrorist gangs in Kenya. And then Algeria, the frogs called the Algerian separatists terrorists. And then in Vietnam, or French Indochina, they called the Viet Minh terrorists. Same people that were armed and trained and supplied by the American Office of Strategic Services during the war against Japan, because the ancestor of the CIA had decided that the only person who could unite Vietnam in a nationalist army to fight against a foreign invader and probably succeed was a bloke called Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, terrorists. Terrorist is anybody who you have no effective military defence against. Goebbels had no effective way to defend against the RAF firebombing his cities, so he called them terrorists. Oh, you're a bunch of fucking terrorists. You're not playing fair. You're beating me. You're beating me. Okay, so the PLO were designated as a terrorist organisation, and their commandos, bravely operating behind enemy lines, they succeeded in capturing a ship full of potential, to them, enemy. They searched the ship, they got the passports, they got one bloke who was an Israeli citizen, dual American citizen, who was old, disabled, bound in a wheelchair. And they threw him off the back of the ship, still in his wheelchair, because it made them feel better. It didn't actually liberate any part of Palestine, but it made the cranky little bastards who had a career in front of them as a Palestinian commander, it made them feel better. And as a response to that, because they went to Libya and Libya wouldn't extradite them, Reagan decided that it was an affront to his sense of justice for there to be countries in the world who did not have extradition treaties with the excited status of Norte Americano. So he passed a law which is still on the books and which states that anybody anywhere in the world, regardless of where they are, if they harm any American citizen, the United States reserves the right to go into that country and capture or kill them. Whether that country has a functioning judicial and policing system and form of government or not, any country that refuses to yield up any person that Ronald Reagan says America has decided is a bad guy, America reserves the right to go in there and capture that person. In the case of the Libyans, they were on an airliner years later. I forget where they were flying. I think it was Libya to Jordan or something like that. But anyway, as they were flying over the Mediterranean, the airliner was intercepted by American fighter aircraft off a carrier battle group and forcibly diverted, I think it was to Italy, and they were taken back to America and charged with murder, and I think they were executed. They might have been put in jail for fucking ever, but yeah, that was when America chose to overturn international law concerning national boundaries and jurisdiction. There is no international jurisdictional boundary anytime America decides that it wants to go and get even with someone it suspects of having hurt an American. And that is why when a minor Arabian princeling declared war on America because after the Soviet puppet regime collapsed in Afghanistan, the American troops later moved into Iraq. No, they moved into Saudi Arabia in order to deal with Iraq. That's right. They went into Saudi Arabia to deal with Iraq during the first Gulf War, Bush Sr.'s Gulf War. And when they'd done with that, Bush Sr. didn't want to get involved in trying to occupy Iraq. He moved the troops back into Saudi Arabia, and Osama bin Laden, he didn't like the idea of all these, I think there was 50,000 American troops more or less permanently encamped on the sacred sand dunes of Saudi Arabia, which was a Muslim country. So he declared, well, first, he was an American ally at the time, and he said, pretty please, you've been supplying me with guns and uniforms for years, fighting on your behalf in Afghanistan against the Soviets. I'm asking you, as an honourable ally who's been twice on the front cover of Time magazine as an American hero, I'm asking you to remove your soldiers from Saudi Arabia. And the Americans said, no, we're going to leave our soldiers right here. So he conducted a limpet mine attack on the USS Cole when I think it was in Somalia or Yemen or tied up to a wharf anyway. He also conducted a truck bombing attack on the parking garage underneath the World Trade Center Twin Towers. So he put himself on the radar as a far-off foreign brown-skinned Fruit Loop Muslim extremist who had declared himself the enemy of America. And then 19 people, I think 15 of them were Saudi Arabians, and 3 of them were Jordanians, and 1 of them was a Portuguese, went to America and camped in a motel and took some flying lessons, didn't progress to the point where they could actually fly a Cessna, and then with box cutters they went and hijacked some aeroplanes, and something happened which enabled those aeroplanes to conduct precision spiral power dives terminating in 2 buildings, after which, remarkably spontaneously, 3 buildings suddenly in a puff of concrete dust and thermite fumes, 3 buildings vertically deconstructed themselves neatly into their own floor plan footprint areas. And this princeling, who at the time was living in Afghanistan, who was a guest of the Afghan government, the recognised government of Afghanistan, recognised by the United Nations, after they had been elected, after the Mujahideen had won against the Soviet puppet regime, and the Taliban was simply the strongest of the varying tribal factions that made up the Mujahideen. Al-Qaeda was another one of the factions, and Al-Qaeda had come there and they helped win the war, and therefore they were honoured guests of the Taliban, who was the recognised government of the country. America said to the Taliban, we want you to give us Osama bin Laden. He's a bad boy. We say he did this Twin Towers attack. We know he already attacked the Twin Towers with a truck bomb. We know he tried to sink the USS Cole. We say he did this. And the Taliban said, look, he's a guest. We have this 1400-year-old tradition that says you don't give up a guest to anybody who is hunting them or pursuing them. You wait till the guest says that they're ready to leave. And the Americans said, you do that and we're going to bomb the shit out of you. And the Taliban said, look, we're between a rock and a hard place. We don't really want to have a war with America, but if you come here and try and take him away, we will defend him because he is a guest and that is our tradition. And under the Ronald Reagan Achille Lauro doctrine, the Yanks went in there and shot their way into Afghanistan, forced the Taliban to run away. A new American puppet regime was installed. And for 20 years, some proportion of the Afghan population supported the puppet regime. Just as 35 years ago, some proportion of the Vietnamese population supported America's corrupt, incompetent, nepotistic puppet regime in South Vietnam, which America had inherited from the French. Corrupt, incompetent, nepotistic puppet regime whose only function was to safeguard the financial interests of French colonialists, people who'd had ancestral holdings in French Indochina since the 1880s, and they wanted them all back at the end of the Second World War. Dien Bien Phu said that wasn't going to happen. The French got their ass handed to them on a plate by General Nguyen Van Guyap. Yeah. The French picked a spot on a map. Oh, look, there's a crossroad in the middle of a valley. We'll go and fortify that and that'll force them to attack us. So they landed, parachute brigade there. And the first thing they did was clear the fucking jungle so they had a clear field of fire. And what General Van Guyap, the Vietnamese general, what he did was he begged, bought and borrowed and stole something like 600 artillery pieces and field guns. And then he trained their crews to break them down into component pieces which could be carried by hand. You know, like 15 people on each end of a pole, and hanging in the middle of the pole is one great big cast iron wheel for a field gun. And he got them all to go 600 different little tracks around the ring of hills which surrounded at a distance of 5 to 8 miles the crossroads of Dien Bien Phu, which the Vietnamese had been fighting over for at least 5,000 years. They had oral history of how to lay siege to Dien Bien Phu, how to resist a siege at Dien Bien Phu, how to defend Dien Bien Phu, how to attack Dien Bien Phu. You know, like, they knew what they were doing, and the frogs had no fucking idea. It was just like, oh, well, we'll just go out there and with our superior firepower, we will defeat these little collywobbles. Didn't work out like that. After all the guns had been transported, after all the guns had been located in caves which had zigzag tunnels so that you could put your gun on a firing platform, shoot it a couple of times, and then wheel your gun back to the end of your zigzag tunnel so that when the French fighter aircraft firing rockets came and tried to fire their rocket down the mouth of the cave, the rocket only got to the first turn of the zigzag. And when the aeroplane went away, you could push your gun back out and do it again. So the frog-eaten parachutists, I think there was 8,000 of them, and 4,000 or 5,500 of them got artilleried into mincemeat. And in the gaps, pardon the pun, in the gaps between the artillery attacks, the Vietnamese engineers dug assault trenches below the level of the gunfire right up to the edges of the French defensive earthworks and perimeter. And yeah, the frog eaters had to surrender, and they had to fuck off and leave South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese were told they could have an election. But America didn't like the fact that they were going to elect a communist government. So America threw money at it and threw weapons at it, and then told absolute fucking lies about dolphins being a communist torpedo attack on an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. So America got itself bogged in an Asian war. Stayed there 10 years. Do we see a pattern here? Somewhere between 5 and 35% of the population in Europe in the Second World War, they were quite happy to be invaded by Germany because they were fucking sick of decadent democratic governments. They quite liked the idea of an authoritarian ruler. There was a Viking division of the SS. There was a Nordland division of the Viking, or Nordland battalion of the Viking SS. There were 3 different ways that a Dutchman could join the German army or the SS and go and fight against the Russians. There were Belgians fighting for the Germans. There were Dutch fighting for the Germans. There were French fighting for the Germans. There were Norwegians, Danish. From all of the occupied countries, there were people who decided to throw their hand in with the occupying foreign invading army because they thought the invaders were going to win. They thought they could do well for themselves. They could get paid. They could live a prosperous life. When the French men couldn't afford to pay the prostitutes went and sold themselves to the German occupying invaders. In Norway, there was a fellow called Vidkun Quisling who agitated, manipulated, machinated, ushered the Germans into Norway and offered to be their Norwegian Prime Minister. He succeeded in having his name become synonymous pretty much from 1940, maybe 38, shall we say to 1980. By that stage, most people had forgotten him. But the word Quisling, to people who are a bit of a scholar of English or history or military politics, the word Quisling means an absolutely scurrilous fucking traitor who sold out all their countrymen. And what happened at the end of the Second World War to the collaborationists and the traitors all over occupied Europe? Did the Germans take them back with them? Well, they tried. Retreating from the Ukraine, they had their girlfriend for as long as she could sit on the outside of the tank until the Soviet fighter bombers shot her off. In France, when the Germans run away from there because, the German population had lost interest in providing enough resources to hold their ground anywhere in their Third Reich. What did the French do to the collaborationists and the traitors who'd thrown their hands in with the occupying foreign forces? They beat them up if they'd only done a few little things. They shot them if they'd done a lot of bad things. They got the whores who'd been paid to fuck the Germans and they shaved their heads so everybody remembered what a fucking bitch they were. What a low-grade, scurrilous, traitorous, seditious scumbag they were. They threw their lot in with the enemy. In Vietnam, it took 3 years after the Americans and the Australians run away. 3 years before the Army of the Republic of Vietnam finally collapsed and the North Vietnamese army moved in and occupied Saigon. I watched it on TV. I was 14 years old. I remember it. It was a shock but no surprise because everybody could see that Vietnam was a lost cause. We'd known that ever since the Tet Offensive when we watched the Saigon Chief of Police shoot a prisoner who was handcuffed in the head in the street simply because the Saigon Chief of Police was pissed off. He was pissed off because somebody had attacked his residence. And this bloke had been arrested somewhere near his residence, so therefore he was automatically assumed to be guilty. So with no due process, no paperwork, no trial, no judge, no jury, no evidence, the Saigon Chief of Police shot him in the head with a revolver. That was the first time I'd ever seen a film of an actual person being shot. The same night's news showed the US Marines desperately attacking the US Embassy in Saigon, trying to fight their way back in. That's when we realised that General Chesty Westmoreland's fucking famous light at the end of the tunnel, it was the train wreck, which was steaming towards him, ready to run straight over the top of American forces in Vietnam. But the fact that it took 3 years that probably indicates that maybe 35% of the Vietnamese population really did support the incompetent, nepotistic, corrupt puppet government in Saigon because it was in their financial interest. They were getting paid. But that means that the army was not made up of people who had honest, noble, honourable motivations for being in the army. They were in the army because they could make money. They weren't in the army because they wanted to defend democracy from communism. They were only in the army as long as America kept throwing money at the problem. And eventually, all of the people who really were desperately keen to defend democracy from communism, they went out and played hopscotch in the minefield and run uphill into the machine guns and the mortar fire and the artillery fire. They all got chopped to fucking mincemeat, turned into compost. The only people who were left at the end of the 3 years were the incompetent, corrupt, nepotistic fucking idiots. And they decided, looked at their gun, looked at the oncoming North Vietnamese, and they said, fuck this for a lark, I'm going home. So they did. And we were all told what a terrible fate was going to befall everybody in South Vietnam. Well, no, actually, 70% of the people in South Vietnam were really fucking pleased that they didn't have to keep fighting their brothers and cousins and uncles on the other side of the border. They got on with being Vietnam and with rebuilding the country, with healing it from the damage that America had done. In the case of Afghanistan, after 20 years and 1.6 trillion fucking dollars, $300 million per day. $300 million a day. There was probably only 5% of the Afghan population who actually supported the whole American mission in Afghanistan. Because all the other people who supported it had fought and suffered all the casualties, because just like in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, it was the local army who took most of the casualties. They'd go out on patrol and get chopped to mincemeat by their cousins because they were fucking traitorous arseholes fighting on the wrong side, and the Americans would sit back there at base. So the Americans, they're boasting about how, in the last 18 months we haven't had a single American killed, like we could have stayed there for longer. And Afghan army, they've had thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands over the years, 300,000, I think, in the last 20 years, killed, fighting to defend their people in the American way. Well, the fact that it didn't take 3 years after America pulled out, it only took 3 months. And when America thought that Kabul was going to stand for at least another 3 months, Kabul stood for 3 days. That gives you an indication of how very few of the Afghan population actually supported the American intervention and presence and occupation in the graveyard of empires. So why now would anybody in Australia or New Zealand or England or Germany or France or America, why would anybody expect that our friendly, traitorous, collaborationist quislings would get anything other than a really big kick up the arse from the Taliban when we run away and abandon them? It's what happens every fucking time. Anybody who says that I've got things out of context, consider this. How did Benedict Arnold's neighbours treat him after George Washington beat the fucking British out of the United States of America? Hey, was Benedict Arnold allowed to keep on going with his life? Or did he become America's national traitorous disgrace in the eyes of all of his neighbours and contemporaries? Because he fought on the wrong fucking side. He fought with the foreign invaders. I think what he did was give the British the plans to West Point, the fortress of West Point. He was a sleazy fucking spy and a turncoat. And the Americans think it's greatly patriotic to talk badly about Benedict Arnold. What a horrible person. But America's traitors, the people that America pays to betray their own government, they're our great mates. We should stay there for another 20 years to safeguard their life. Another point about Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, anywhere where they practice a really strict form of esoteric Islamic religion. Egypt, perhaps, where they practice female genital mutilation. In Egypt, it's not the men who cut the clitorises off the little girls, it's the women, it's the mothers and the grandmothers. In Afghanistan, do you know how much childcare your average Afghan Muslim extremist engages in? How many dirty, shitty nappies does an Afghan man change? Fucking none. Talk to the anthropologists, the neuropsychologists, the educationalists, and they'll all tell you that the most critical time for teaching humans everything about their life is the first 3.5 years. I put it to you that if the women in Afghanistan wanted the men in Afghanistan to behave any differently to the way they behave now, those women would raise their sons not to be fucking misogynistic assholes. But that's not what the women in Afghanistan do. The women in Afghanistan raise their men to live in accordance with a code of behaviour that stretches back to the time when Alexander the Greekling conquered Afghanistan, and Afghanistan discovered what happens if you have a beautiful wife or a pretty daughter approaching puberty when an occupying, invading army takes over your country. So everywhere that Alexander the Greekling conquered in his world-travelling homophobic discovery tour, not homophobic, homosexual discovery tour, what happened? To this day, in that country, be it Lebanon, Greece, Italy, Egypt, Morocco, Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, the women cover themselves up. They won't let you see their hair because long, beautiful hair is an attractive thing. Some of them won't let you see their ankles. You know, they're like English Victorian women. Got to have a dress that goes all the way to your toes because your ankles, if a man sees your ankles, he's going to be driven mad by lust. In England, they were so far up themselves when Queen Victoria was on the throne that you weren't permitted to put a book written by a man on a shelf adjacent to a book written by a woman unless the man and the woman were married to each other, because otherwise it was unseemly. It was licentious. Tablecloths had to go all the way to the floor because the limbs of the kitchen table might incite passions by making people think about legs on humans and what's at the top of human legs as reproductive organs. You're not allowed to think about that. It's not so very far back in time when my culture's ideas of how to behave honourably and normally were completely fucking insane by today's standards. If the Afghans want to live by what we consider to be insane standards, that's their fucking business. If they are still reacting to having been occupied by Alexander the Greekling 3,500 years ago, okay, that's what they're doing. You're not going to convince them any differently by occupying their country and bombing them because they were providing a safe haven for somebody who America says they were pissed off about. So, yeah, America was playing to lose from the moment it tried to occupy Afghanistan. Occupying Afghanistan didn't work for the Soviet Union. Why would it work for the United States of North America? Occupying Afghanistan didn't work for the British Empire. Didn't even really work out well for Alexander the Greekling. I think Genghis Khan had a go at him too, and he took all of their best engineers and artisans back to Peking to do ceramic work and large-scale irrigation workings there. But the idea that you can go to the extreme ends of the earth and fight a high-tech war against a low-tech, local, native-based opponent, and you're going to win because you've got a shinier gun. It's just bullshit. In fact, according to the anthropologists and the archaeologists and the psychologists, because humans are primates, we can apply knowledge and data that we've discovered by studying primates. And what they've found is that the more often a primate fights, which gives you an indication that they might be an inherently angry, cranky sort of an individual. They may have a chip on their shoulder. Something's happened which has turned them into a difficult person to get along with, or a difficult individual to get along with. The more often a primate fights, then there's a correlation between how far away from their home territory they are when they fight. The more the primate fights, the further away from their home ground they fight. And the official hypothesis, don't know whether you can ever advance it to becoming a theory. It might be a theorem, but anyway, the official hypothesis is that an individual who's got a chip on their shoulder and can't get along with any of their fellow community members, they argue with every individual member of the community, and pretty soon they get a reputation for being a total fucking pain in the ass and not worth talking to. Because you know that as soon as that individual comes towards you, they're going to talk to you, they're going to interact for a while, and then they're going to complain about something you said or something you did or something you didn't say or something you didn't do. And before you know it, they're going to want to fight you. So it's easier to just turn around and go somewhere else and leave them with nobody to talk to. So the individual who fights most often is forced to go far away from their home range where they're well known and widely understood. They have to go somewhere else and find a stranger and talk to the stranger and argue with the stranger and then fight with the stranger. And that's half of the story. The other half of the story, and it's even funnier, the further a primate is from their home territory when they fight, the more often that primate loses when they fight. So, for example, World War II, when the Germans started fighting, they were fighting against Poland and then Norway and France, and Belgium and Holland and Denmark, and they had a lot of success. And then they got involved in Greece and Yugoslavia, and they were also involved propping up the Italians in North Africa. And the further they went, initially the better success they had, but then the occupation got a bit difficult because they were running into partisan activity and their supply lines were stretched. And then they had a fight with Russia. And the further they went, initially great success, and then their supply lines and logistics got stuffed. And then they found themselves being overwhelmed by people who understood the local conditions a lot better than the Germans did. And before they knew it, they were on the back foot, they were retreating, they'd lost the bloody war, and their country was basically fire-bombed and artilleried into a shithole. The Japanese pulled the same trick. They went a long way into China and got bogged down there. They went a long way into the South Pacific and got bogged down there. They went into Southeast Asia and got stuck in the fucking jungle. And the further away they went, the more they eventually lost. It's just what happens. Britain, kind of a bit difficult to get my head around what was going on there, but if you accept the idea that the British Empire was scattered all over the world and it had been that way for hundreds of years, the British were attacked in North Africa and they won after they were attacked. They were attacked in Southeast Asia and eventually they won. They went back there. In England, the Germans bombed the British, annoyed them, gave them the shits, but it didn't defeat them. No way was England defeated by Germany bombing them. The further the Germans and the Japanese went in order to have a fight, the more often they lost the fight. America was attacked in its home ground. They'd had possession of the Philippines since before the start of the 20th century. They'd had possession of the Hawaiian Islands for over 100 years. America was attacked. America fought back against its attackers. Not quite entirely certain why it worked out well for America that they got involved in the European war, because America didn't really have that much interest in Europe apart from the American-owned refineries in Romania, which they duly went on to bomb because those refineries were supplying the Germans. But the fact remains, the more often a primate fights, the more often they lose, and the more often they fight, the further away from home they are when they fight, and the further away from home they are when they fight, the more often they lose. So, quite honestly, for America to have gone to Afghanistan, as pretty much as far as you can go from America, to have a fight with a bunch of local yokels who've been living there and defeating foreign invaders for 3,500 years, there was no way America ever had any chance of winning against the Afghans. If America wants to defeat the Afghans, they have to entice the Afghans to go to America, and then it'll be the Afghans who are fighting away from home, and then the Americans will be the ones who win the contest, just like they won against King George back in the 1770s. 250 years ago, America won because they were the locals, they were the guerrillas, they were the insurgents, they were the Minutemen who could react to a bloody occupying English force coming within sight. Every reason why George Washington won is the same reasons why America lost in Afghanistan, why America lost in Iraq, did America succeed in Syria? Is Somalia better because of America's intervention? The fucking Korean War's still underway. They've only got an armistice. They've got a ceasefire, but they haven't actually signed a peace treaty. I tell you, humanity is playing to lose. Between COVID, the biodiversity crisis, the mass extinction, and global warming, what are we worried about? Fucking traitorous Afghan interpreters who want to run away from the Taliban. And they want to go somewhere else in the world where they won't have to live with the consequences of their actions. How would I feel if the Indonesians or the Chinese come to Australia and occupied Australia, and one of my neighbours decided to go and function as an interpreter for the Chinese or the Indonesian army to run around and burn my house to the ground so that I can't possibly give any aid or assistance to any local yokels who are trying to fight back? How would I feel about the interpreter, the person who gives local advice to the foreign invaders? After the foreign invaders go away, that's when the quislings always get their balls nailed to the fucking wall. It's normal. It's to be expected. It's what they should have understood before they got involved with it. And like I said, if the Afghan women want the Afghan men to behave any different, they would have raised their sons to behave like gentlemen. And they didn't. They raised their sons to be successful guerrilla insurgents. And who trained them? Who trained the Afghans to fight as modern guerrilla insurgents? They were trained by warrant officers from the British Special Air Services Regiment. Back in the days when the Mujahideen were fighting against the Soviet puppet incompetent regime, the United States State Department purchased weapons that the Israelis had captured from the Egyptians, air freighted them to Pakistan. The United States State Department funded madrasas in Pakistan, and the United States State Department come up with a employment contract with the British Department of Defence, which enabled British SAS warrant officer instructors to go out to the madrasas and train the mujahideen, all of the mujahideen, the Mujj, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, anybody who wanted the Northern Alliance, anybody who wanted to fight against the Soviets, the US and the British trained and armed and equipped. Why was it that Australia didn't really do so well in Afghanistan? That would be because Australia's SAS were trained by the British SAS in the 1960s for operations in Malaya. The Mujahideen were trained by the British during the 1980s for operations against the Soviets. So the Mujahideen had read the entire SAS operating handbook. Why did Idi Amin last as long as he did? Why did Robert Mugabe last as long as he did? Because their personal palace guards, whatever you want to call them, they were all trained by the British SAS. Back in those days, no nation, no emergent nation, especially not with a dictator, wanted to have their presidential security trained by the Americans because the Americans had had 2 fucking presidents shot out from under them. Yeah, Ronald Reagan got shot under the noses of his security detail. He survived, but he did get shot. Kennedy got shot and killed under the noses of his security detail. There are even people who say that the fatal shot to the back of his head was caused by the security guard with a revolver in his hand trying to jump onto the back of the presidential limousine. And when he landed on the presidential limousine, clonk, as his hand hit the bloody boot, the gun went off and fired into the back of the president's head. It's a theory. It's one of the theories. Shit, there's a lot of theories about that one. Can't say as I remember it because I was 2 years old in 1963. But anyway, I'm starting to grow somewhat hoarse from this little chat, little walk and talk. But yeah, these are some of the issues which have been occupying my mind, among other things like how I was going to get my mother home from Newcastle when Newcastle was locked down, and then fortuitously Armidale got locked down. So it's okay to move somebody from one contaminated zone to another contaminated zone. And then, fortuitously, the whole of the Hunter New England Area Health Region was locked down. So I was able to get her from Armidale to here. And while I was getting her, I was able to collect the push bike. The fabled electric sitting down running machine that I've been chasing for a year and a half. Oh, I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Having weighed the troubles of the world in my little scales, I can't say that I've solved any of them, but I have certainly described them and analysed what's involved with all of them. And I think the bats are at the very forefront of the ecology of the biosphere, having made an executive decision to reduce humanity's herd numbers. I mean, at the moment, 96% of all the vertebrate biomass, every living animal with a backbone on planet Earth, it's either a human, it is domestic livestock belonging to a human, or it is a pet belonging to a human. All the feral animals, all the wild animals, all the fish in the ocean, all the whales, all the birds, all the lizards, they all make up maybe 3.5% of everything alive in the animal kingdom. Not counting the insects, because most of them are fucking dead because of, I think, of the neonicotinoid insecticides that have been deployed by our agricultural specialists for the last 20 years. The bat eaters lament viri because there are several of them. The first one was Marburg virus. It appeared in 1976. was 99% kill rate. Marburg virus was so efficacious that generally it killed everybody in the village before anybody could survive long enough to run to another village because they were running away from the plague, taking it with them, as usual. Then there was Ebola, kills 60 or 70%, depending on whether you get treatment or not. Then there was the first SARS, and there was MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, camel kisses disease, where the bat shits in the camel water trough and the camel gets sick, and then the Sheikh of Arabia goes and kisses his sick camel and he gets the respiratory syndrome. Then there was Hendra virus, and now there's COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. And the cherry on top of the cake is that last week somebody in Guinea in Africa died of Marburg virus because it's re-emergent in Africa. I tell you, the bats have fucking got the shits with us. I can see why they've got the shits with us. It seems like the bats have decided that we are not likely to take action voluntarily to reduce our carbon emission footprint. We're not likely to take action voluntarily to halt the mass species extinction. We're not likely to take any action voluntarily to do anything useful about anything because we want to grow our economy. We want to make more money next year than we made this year, and we want to make more money this year than we made last year. So I think the bats have decided to reduce our numbers beyond the point where we cannot sustain any kind of industrial activity, including burning fossil carbon, anywhere on Earth. Whether they leave enough of us alive to continue human culture is debatable. I don't think human civilization is going to survive. Whether life on Earth will survive what we've done to the fucking atmospheric heat engine, I don't know. The thing is, every exhaust stroke worth of carbon dioxide coming out of my chainsaw, my whippersnipper, my water pump, my generator, my motor car, my leaf blower, every exhaust stroke of carbon dioxide that I put up there, it's going to take 25 years for it to finish achieving 95% of all the warming it's going to be responsible for. 25 years. So when you see the TV show you today's fucking wildfires ravaging North America, the floods in Turkey or in Holland or in Germany or China, fuck, they had 6,000 people drowned in one car tunnel in China when the river flooded. When you see all that, I want you to remember that that's all because of refined transport fuel that I burned in 1996 or before. All of this shitty weather, it's because of what we did before 1996. It means that if the bat eaters lament viruses kill all of us within the next week, if 99.9% of humanity dies and 0.1% survives, those survivors are going to have to put up with the weather getting hotter and wetter and windier and hailier and droughier and fiercer and more intense and more extreme for 25 years before it stabilises. And that's a bit of a worry. It really is. I don't see any way out of that. No way out of that one at all, is there? Because the people who live in the towns and the cities and the suburbs, they're not going to permit the politicians to do anything concrete and effective to reduce our fossil carbon footprint. Our official plan is to grow the economy until the wheels fall off the ecology and everybody dies. And for 40 years, I've always considered that really the only worthwhile game in town is to see how long one can personally outlive the rest of civilization when it fucks up and goes away. Because that's what it's bound and determined to do. That's what it's decided to do. It's what it's voted to do. It's what I was worried that Australia was going to do when I made up this sticker, vote green or die, global warming coals. And that is a noun. If you believe that voting green is a bad idea, that is a noun and you are a coal. If you accept that voting green is a good idea because global warming coals, then that is a verb, because global warming does coal. And like ember attack. Well, the sea level rise falls down from the skies, sweeping all who ignore it away. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.